tonight. There's about a team of 12 of us, and I'm sure you all know where we are. We're sort of in Home Park on one base, and then we also have a base in Holly Lodge in Richmond Park. We do some work in Bushy Park, and we also take the horses into central London. But I'm going to start with probably what was the highlight of our year, one of the highlights of our year, which was the Platinum Jubilee, because interspersed all of this, we do work with historic royal palaces and the royal parks, and therefore from time to time we're asked to kind of do some ceremonial work as well. And a very nice little anecdote was that so you all know the behind the scenes at Hampton Court programme, I'm sure, Channel 5, starring our very own Ed McDowell, and all the Shire horses as well. So I got a call from Terry Penry, who was Her Late Majesty's stud groom, and he said Her Majesty's been watching the programme on Hampton Court behind the scenes, and she's asked if you could provide 2 grey Shire horses for the parade at the Platinum Jubilee. And at that point I wasn't sure exactly what to think, and one of the things that I remembered all the time thinking, I had no idea she watched Channel 5. It was sort of a rather sweet idea somehow, kind of seeing the Queen sitting in Windsor Castle tucked away and actually watching Channel 5 with probably everyone of her same sort of age bracket doing the same. So we went to Windsor Castle for a week, and we had a lot of leading out the procession of the native breeds of horses that were there, and the specific point was that they had to be platinum, so they all had to be greys or white horses. And the reason, I suppose, why the Queen didn't have those kind of horses herself is because they're incredibly rare. There's about 200 of these grey Shire horses left in the world. There's about 1,800 Shire horses left in the world, 1,800 brood mares left in the world, and that's not just this country, that's counting Australia, America and everywhere else as well. So there is a very real sort of issue around, we're all focusing on protecting pandas, protecting tigers, and of course we should do all those kind of things. But right under our noses there's something that's, I think, very quintessentially British of a breed that's also in great demise and a threat of extinction as well. And of course you could ask the question, why should we preserve? Maybe it's just natural selection, maybe we should just let them go, and all of that. And I think the reason why we feel quite strongly about it is that ultimately the Shire horse isn't a natural horse. It was designed to become the biggest horse in the world. And the origins of that lie nowhere else than at Hampton Court Palace, because it was Henry VIII who put a law through that forbade people to breed with smaller horses, because he wanted to breed the biggest war horse possible. And a little bit later, they got wind of it in Scotland, so they decided to have a breeding program there as well, which is where we got the Clydesdale coming up. So it's no coincidence that in this country, the world's biggest horses are the Shire horse in England and the Clydesdale in Scotland, kind of having that sort of age-old rivalry between England and Scotland, even in the breeding of horses. So after war horses, of course, we know the Shire horse as the great agricultural horse. All the ploughing, all the land work was done by Shire horses. Then the Industrial Revolution sort of hit, then the Shire horses became the lorries. They kind of went on the docks in Liverpool to kind of unload absolutely everything. They kind of would transport everything. And if you go to the Transport Museum in London, you will see a little maquette built where you see a Shire horse taking the spoils from the tunnels of the underground, and in fact kind of working themselves into redundancy in that kind of process. So now 2022, is there really a use for this horse? We very much think there is. What we don't want to do with Operation Centaur is not about romanticising. We don't romanticize about some far-flung past where everything was much better and idyllic, but actually kind of looking at how can we create a space that's relevant for these working Shire horses. And in these incredible pockets of green we have around us, in some ways you could argue it makes no sense really to work with machines in there. You know, shire horses can do all the work that we really need to be done. And of course shire horses need to work as well. You can't really keep them as a pet. Apart from anything else, they cost too much to keep. You know, if you have a Welsh Section A, which is about this big, it kind of thrives on, you know, fresh air and scenery. A shire horse takes a huge amount of food to keep well, and they actually need a purpose. Like most of us, we kind of, you know, they've been bred for generations to be working horses. They crave the contact with humans. Our horses, when you go out into the field, they queue up to come into work. A lot of people talk about their horses and they can never catch them. Our horses queue up to come in because they really want to kind of come and do the work. They're interested to come and engage and do things. Because the work we do with them is also quite varied, and I'm going to talk you through that a little bit tonight. So this is one of the kind of big jobs that they have in the summer. We provide carriage rides in Hampton Court Palace, these front gardens, usually starting every year at Good Friday, and we are ending on the 5th, I think, isn't it? Kind of at the end of the half term now, and hopefully we will be back for the winter as well, because now Hampton Court Palace is also doing a light show. Hopefully we're going to have some horses there as well, so watch this space. Those of you who come to Hampton Court for the Christmas events, do come and see us there. I'm going to just quickly go back to this, because this was some of the summer Easter rides that we did in Bushy Park as well, and what we're using there is a shire bank. The shire bank that was built by Hampton Court to kind of commemorate Queen Victoria opening the gardens back in the day. And these shire banks would have been the vehicles by which people would come from the centre of town to Hampton Court to come and visit. So the yellow and black vehicle that you will see there. Again, I'm going to make plugs like Rebecca as well. We're going to talk a lot about carriage rides and there's other kind of amazing things that we do. This is the shire bank with 2 bays, and this is in Home Park, where we're just sort of getting the horses ready to exercise. It looks like a heavy vehicle, but it's actually quite a light vehicle. It all depends on the surface that we kind of use it with. So this is really all about keeping that heritage aspect into it. You know, how do people do this? One of the big arguments that Operation Central tends to make is that we believe that the skills to work with horses are going to die out long before the actual horses are going to die out. So it's actually really quite important to kind of bring younger people into it and actually teach them. So Ed and Tom and people like them can actually kind of show this is how you start a horse to kind of do this kind of work. This is how this work is done. These are the ways that you approach horses in these kind of situations, and this is also then in a moment I'll show you how you work the land as well, because those skills are very much at the risk of dying out. So if you know anyone who is interested in a career with heavy horses, do send them our way. I think sometimes it's really quite hard for us, because we do find people maybe who from 300 miles away want to come and work. It's very difficult for them to come into this area, because it's actually very difficult to find accommodation for them as well. So there's lots of variables that kind of conspire against kind of bringing younger people into working with heavy horses. William, and you'll recognise the Kingston Avenue there, and this is one of the greys. This is a grey called Nobby, one of the ones that went to the Platinum Jubilee, and this is Nobby in a carriage in Richmond Park as well. I'll tell you a little bit more about these sort of carriage rides. We do them from time to time. So we don't hire carriages out. Like for example, we very rarely do a wedding or a private sort of hire, because we're not really set up for that. But what we do is from time to time we have a period where we make the horses available and people can actually come onto the carriage and have a ride around. And we started with that about 10 years ago with the Christmas rides and the winter rides in Richmond Park. Which is the conservation. This is the kind of a blessing of the plough at the Wellington barracks on Birdcage Walk in town. That happened in January traditionally, so we were invited there to kind of bring the plough and a horse, which was one of the first times they had done that for very, very many times. They kind of intended to bring ploughs in, but they hadn't actually had a plough for many years that was attached to a horse, and a horse that actually could plough with a plough, and a person who knew how to actually operate the plough to work with the horse as well. So that's quite a special moment to be able to do that in central London. Here's Tom with a pair of bays, just harrowing. So this is really harrowing. What we're trying to do with the grasslands in a way is kind of bring them back to how they would have been kept in days gone past. So in the winter, you would normally have had grazing on the grassland, which would have meant that it would almost kind of be gone to the root. There would be nothing much left because the sheep would go and finish off whatever there was. Of course, now that's not the case anymore, so we need to almost kind of artificially create that, because that's really what wildflower meadows like. They want to kind of have that sort of scarifying of the soil in the winter. So the harrowing really is done. This is a chain harrow that's used here. In the winter as well, this is Thomas Murdoch logging. So we go around kind of taking logs and trees that are falling down out of woodland. Again, with a horse, you don't really disturb the undergrowth all that much. Horses thread lightly. As David Attenborough would say, kind of there's a lot about this threading lightly in the parks with the horses, because if you had to bring heavy machinery in that, you'd damage quite a lot of things. So horses can actually go right deep into the forest, quite steep hills, places where machines would never really get to, and you can extract them with a horse. And it's one of the most amazing things to witness, because that's really when you see that relationship working. Operation Centaur is really all about relationships. It's about how we preserve relationships between humans and animals, and how we do that through the heritage work that we do, but also how we do that through the conservation work and then extend it into the therapy work as well. This is in Clapham Junction. We nearly cause accidents when people kind of start looking and start thinking what's there. And this is another, I think, really, really important element, because this is the community element of it. If you're in the Massey Ferguson, nobody stops and wants to talk to you. But when you see shire horses around, people stop and talk and reminisce and tell you stories. Everybody tells us stories about the young horses, or when their parents were working, their grandparents were working with horses. So there's a community, and I think it actually allows, particularly, not so much here, because I think there is community here quite a lot, but in central London, there's a lot of loneliness. There's lots of people who are actually coming up, and you can see they're not really talking to anybody, but they're wanting to come to the horses, so the horses become that focal point of actually being able to have a conversation, to kind of that bridge, and to have a connection. And talking and language in that way is really what I want to talk about a bit when we get to the therapy. Bracken are a really big issue. Bracken, in a way, I'm sure you're familiar with this, but bracken is the first return to an oak forest, isn't it? This would all have been oak forest, and the first sign of nature wanting to go back to its original state is the kind of the bracken on the growth, so then we can have the saplings, and then we have the oak forest back. Because the parks are triple SI for their acid grassland, we can't just let the bracken do its thing, because the whole park will become bracken. Spraying, huge issues. I don't really want to go into the controversies around spraying. I'm sure you kind of have your views on that. We prefer doing it with the horses, and because what we really do with the horses is we don't kill the plant, we crush the stems in about 3 or 4 places, and that means that the rhizomes kind of use all their energy to try to repair themselves, which means they don't have the energy to go and spread. So it's a really elegant way of dealing with something that you feel actually there's a place for bracken, of course, because there's some moths that kind of there's birds, there's the calves that kind of hide them when they're first born. So I think there's not sort of a sensitivity to get rid of the bracken, but the bracken needs to be managed and maintained. And doing that with the horses, I think, is in a really elegant way. It doesn't damage the ant hills or anything like that either. And then we get to making hay while the sun shines, and not a huge amount of hay this year, but there's something quite nice about making our own hay in a way, kind of actually using the horses to cut the grass, then to rake it, then to bale it, and then to actually have it as fodder in the winter. So there's a real sort of low footprint of producing and sustaining something. We do that. We work with, in Hyde Park, there's a big wildflower meadow that we manage there. There's lots of schools that come there, and the kids start helping to collect all the arisings and put it all together. So again, a really community aspect to that as well. And this is Morden Hall, where there's quite a lot of land as well for us to kind of, so in effect, we're kind of almost sustainable in having our own hay just by working quite locally. This is Hyde Park, and this is two old shire horses that they're no longer with us, sadly, Aragon and Roy, and they kind of, in a way, give a good example of how retired horses can still kind of be useful and still have a purpose as well. Because there comes a point in any working horse's life that you can't really get them to do the heavy lifting anymore. And with the therapy work, of course, that's when these older horses come into their own, because they still want to have that engagement, they still want to have that kind of connection. And where the word centaur sort of for us comes from is not so much the usual half person, half horse, but I think it's more speaking to the fact that the horses become very human after a while. Older horses have studied us their whole entire lives. They can predict exactly what we're going to do next. And this is why they're incredibly useful for me as a therapist to kind of work with them, because I can read them like an open book, and I can see how they react to other people, because they express themselves just as any person expresses themselves. Horses are very, very individual. They have their own personalities. I mean, for those of you who have chickens, or have been around chickens, chickens have their own personalities. They kind of, they have that. We had a chicken that flew the coop at 3:15 every day, went off, nobody knew where she went, and then she came back about an hour later. What kind of secret liaison was that chicken having at that time? We don't know. But it was just that one, and all the others were just about going around their business. So with horses, the same thing. They become almost sort of half human by the time they're about 10 or 11, and these older horses in particular, we could kind of read them like a book. As a therapist, what that means is it means that you can actually bring the horse into the center of the therapy. Because horses are expert communicators, but they don't require language to do it. And of course, language is how therapy works. Freud's talking cure, that's really the origin of all of this. We can all remember having some feelings inside of us, and we can't put a name to that. We feel uncomfortable, we feel a knot in our stomach, we don't feel right, there's something bothering us. And then all of a sudden, through, a cup of tea with a neighbour, we can start putting some words to that, words come out, and all of a sudden something becomes shared. So actually what's happening is something that's inside of us becomes outside of us. The words are the vehicle to kind of bring something to the outside. That's how therapy works. That's the essence of how therapy works. But what do you do if you don't want to talk? Or if you can't talk? Or if the things that you hold inside of yourself are too shameful and you feel you're going to be judged when you talk about them? And these are the things that people feel. These are the things that people feel the resistance to the talking therapies, because it's not easy. to actually just go to a total stranger and start talking about these things that bother you. So I get people to go and talk to my horses, and they come back, and then I ask them what that was like, and I tell them right from the beginning, you don't have to tell me what you said, this horse, that's between you and the horse. But what I'm going to ask you is what that experience was like. And invariably, people talk about it being not as bad as I thought it was going to be, etc., and they feel relief and all of that. So I think, isn't it quite interesting that, just by going to this animal and saying something, it shifts something quite substantially, quite powerfully in you. So that's the beginning of a trust relationship, right? And the moment you start building a trusting relationship with someone, you can actually do some work with them therapeutically. And the horse stays the center of all of this. So I published a book about 2 years ago, which is sort of the first evidence-based book, and it sort of details all the work we've been taking shire horses into prisons. We kind of work with schools. We work with the full range of sort of mental health diagnoses, from eating disorders through addiction, through anxiety, depression, spectrum, ASD, ADHD, eating disorders, the whole kind of range. And because we've been doing this for quite some time, we managed to kind of actually do some kind of real pre and post evaluation. So we've got some very nice evidence to show that horses really are effective in psychotherapy for people who are less likely or less willing to talk in the first instance. I think my observation with that is that horses do in therapy what they've always done for us, which is they speed things up. And that's really the role, and that's why we've always had some affinity to horses in our lives from the very beginning. So there's no magic, there's no jumping through hoops of fire, there's no feathers on their heads. It's really all about the very basics about how do you build a relationship, how do you make sense of yourself, how do you make decisions, how do you create further understanding. And that my job as a therapist is not really to change you. My job as a therapist with my horses is to bring you a greater level of insight and a greater level of understanding, so you can make better choices that work for you. So there's no one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter approach. So that, in a nutshell, I could spend 24 hours talking and not be finished, but that sort of in a nutshell is really how therapy with horses works. I think a really important point is, which I'm talking to quite a lot of people around, kind of getting some definitions right, is the difference between something being therapeutic and something being therapy. Because going for a walk with your dog, stroking your dog is therapeutic, stroking a cat is therapeutic, having your nails done is therapeutic, having a bath is therapeutic, brushing a horse is therapeutic, or going shopping for some people is therapeutic. But all of these things are not therapy, because really the moment the activity stops, the effect of that activity wears off, probably in a curve that goes quite steep pretty quickly. For something to be therapy, a certain processing needs to go on during that time as well. A certain addressing of something needs to go on, number one. And number two, you also need a person who's trained, who can actually do that, who can facilitate that. Because if those two elements are not in place, then we're actually creating quite volatile situations where people can get hurt quite quickly. In particular, the person who takes the role of the therapist. Because that person is not working within ethical guidelines, that person is not working in self-care, they're probably wanting to rescue, and all those kind of things are really big triggers for burnout, and there's a lot of work to be done around that in that space. So I think an important point, therapeutic versus therapy. And then part of the heritage is kind of really getting people to remember how things were done, like platting up the horses. How do we do that? What's the the significance of all of that? We've got the yellow and the gold of Hampton Court that we use as the colours for the greys. So a lot goes on in terms of platting up the tails, putting all the various sort of ribbons into that. This is us at the show with Heath winning a prize. And this is, I think, one of the first dates coming up for your diaries, which is the 20th of November, and all of those who are members of Historic Royal Palaces can come. Actually, I think it's also an open gardens weekend, the 20th. Okay. So yeah, you don't even have to be a member. You can just come and see us. We have the last Sunday before Advent. We have what's called Shire Horse Sunday, where we prepare all the Shire horses, 13 this year, although we may not really want to, probably only going to be 12. You'll see George, 2-year-old George, which I'll talk to him about in a moment as well. So we get all the horses ready, and the chaplain of the Chapel Royal comes out, blesses the horses, and it's just quite a nice way for us to kind of pause and sort of reflect on, what a year we've had, go out for a drink afterwards and sort of think, how amazing does this look? Because it's quite a challenge to go anywhere and find that amount of Shire horses in one place, and seeing them all done up in their finery, walking through one of the most amazing spaces we have. So that's the 20th of November at 3 o'clock. And they all line up. And this is George. So we decided, because you remember that there's only 200 of the grey Shire horses left, we sort of felt that we probably needed to do something about that. And we don't normally breed horses because it's very intensive to kind of look after a horse in the spaces that we have here. If you're in the countryside, a foal when it's 100 days old gets separated from the mare. You throw it in a big field, you don't look at it for 5 years, and you come back, and then you kind of start working with them. We have to kind of invest 5 years into a horse before the horse can start working. But with the greys, we thought it was really quite important. So the first one that came along was Hampton Court George. We also got the prefix awarded. So every horse that's now every Shire horse that's now being born is going to have Hampton Court and then the name of the horse. And it was the first Shire horse in living memory that was actually born at Hampton Court. I don't think we could actually find any records of Shire horses, because the royal family bred their Shire horses in Sandringham, so there wouldn't have been any breeding of Shire horses at Hampton Court, so it was definitely a first. And for London, I don't think Shire horses were born in London, thought they'd be born in the Shires and then brought in as working horses. So it was quite a big moment for us. And George has also shown to be an absolute star as well, because he's never had, I think, a bad experience in his whole life. He's been around us all the time. He's incredibly trusting as a horse, and he's going to be making a very special horse. This is him just hiding behind his mum there. And those of you who know him, you'll kind of be quite surprised when you see him at Hampton Court for the Shire Horse Show this year, because he has grown quite a lot. We've done a lot of filming this year as well, because part of what we feel we need to do is kind of draw attention to what we're doing, kind of keep Shire horses in the news. This was for the Fédération Équestrienne Internationale filming because they've never done anything on shire horses, they've never done anything on equine assisted psychotherapy, so we're working with them. There is a new series of behind the scenes, behind closed doors at Hampton Court, I think, coming out at some point as well. There is a series in Channel 4 with the Royal Parks that's coming out. So there's lots of different ways that we kind of try and keep sort of the idea of working horses in urban environments. So to elaborate on the first point I was making, we're not romanticizing something, we're not campaigning to return the whole country back to working with real horsepower. What we are saying is that actually if you can see the benefits of working with horses in London, it makes economic sense, it makes sense for nature and conservation, and it definitely makes sense for the people element in it as well. Plus we are doing something, giving something back to this horse. So the last job that we just did this year was collecting the floral tributes for Her Late Majesty the Queen in the Green Park and in Hyde Park. So maybe Edward, you want to say a bit about that, because you were the person who was actually doing it.
So we got a call from the Royal Parks because they didn't want to send in dustbin lorries and whatever and throw all these things up and take them away. And it also was a precedent, because when Princess Diana died, they used the shire horses, because at that time the Royal Parks had a pair of shire horses. Before our time, it was way back in 97, I think. So they used it to clear all the flowers away from Kensington Palace. So they decided to use us, and so what we had to do was take them to Green Park, and they would separate all the plastic from the flowers and all the teddy bears and all the things that were left there, and some very strange things were left there. And then we'd throw the flowers onto the back of the dray. We had a big dray there. And then we would go from there to Kensington Gardens, where they've got a big depot where they mulch all this stuff up. Huge machine to do it. And of course it meant we had to go across Hyde Park Corner, and every other day they had the changing of the guards, so that was all closed off. But it was great because the police would open the big barriers so we could just go through, so it felt very, very important. And going across Hyde Park Corner under Wellington Arch and then across on the other side, the horses always got a bit nervous, and we later found out from the guys from the Royal Mews that it's because underneath is the tube station, and they can actually feel the vibrations in their feet going across. Obviously a very strange sensation for a big horse. But they were good, we got across and they got used to it. And it went on for a week. We got most of it. They did have to come in a bit later and take some of the other stuff away, but we got most of it done. So that was a great honour to do, actually, and I enjoyed doing it as well. We made it all over the world. Different little clips of newspapers turned up, and on the telly, and videos, and YouTube, and God knows what. But it went down very well.
Thank you. And the nice story around it, I think, was, of course, is that it is a sort of cycle of life, isn't it? It's the kind of the flowers there, and actually those same flowers that were given as a tribute are now going to be used for compost, for the beds in front of Buckingham Palace, and for the Royal Park. So there's a really, really nice sort of symmetry there. And for us, I think also a really nice symmetry in a way is because we use the same two horses that did the Platinum Jubilee in May, and we brought the same horses to then also do the work, taking the flowers away. So it's quite moving and quite special. Sort of very strange to think that in May we were all excited and so gleaming everything and kind of polishing everything up and all of that, and having this big celebration, and then a mere few months later then we're doing the collecting of all of that. I'll pause there for a moment and wait for your questions.